I've been mixing tracks in the DAW for many years now, and there's one specific technique I use that works really well for me. I figured out how to do that in the MPC One and tried it on a song I've been working on for the last week. Here's what it sounds like before. And here's after mixing and mastering. In this video today, I'll be showing you 5 things that made the biggest difference in achieving these results. The first thing is so important. While you're still in production mode, even when you start, decide how you're going to handle your low end. The kick I decided to go with, you can see on the meter here, it's coming in at 55 Hertz. Now that I know, I can label my kick 55 Hertz or a low A. You want to decide whether you're going to have a kick you can feel and a bass you can hear, or vice versa. I decided to take my bass higher. I'm using the Odyssey plugin, which is fantastic for bass. And since I'm writing my own bass line, that lets me choose the notes. 55 Hertz is an A, so I decided to go to C sharp for the fundamental of my bass line. It does drop a little lower, but you notice that's going to mostly be on the offbeat, whereas my kick is going to be on the downbeat. I can avoid having them hit at once. Now, of course, you could duck it out of the way with something like the Mother Ducker using sidechain compression, but then you're committing to the pumpy sound right from the start, and you're adding complexity, and you're likely to lose the transients at the beginning of your bass sound. This second thing is going to save you a lot of time and potentially keep your system from crashing. You need to set up properly. I'm going to show you how to do that now. Start by saving a new version. That's as simple as save, project as. You're probably familiar with this. Next, you want to purge any unused sequences, tracks, programs, or samples. So for sequences, you can click Next Sequence, get a bird's eye view of your sequences. Click on any of the sequences you're not using. Then go to Main. That's just the fastest way I find. Click the pencil, and you can click Clear to get rid of it. To clear tracks, you clear here. And to clear programs, it's a little finicky. The way I do it is if you go to an empty track and you find the program that you want to clear, and then click the pencil and delete. That's the best way to delete a program. That's because it may not be in a track, it may just be sitting there. For samples, you want to make sure that all the samples that you're not using are not in any programs. You want to go to Menu, click Mem CPU, and that's where you'll find the Purge button. Click Purge, and again, this is why we saved in advance, so you know you're not messing anything up. You can always go back to the previous version. Be really careful here. Unused samples or all, you want to do unused, and tap that. Then you've got a nice clean slate. You can guarantee your CPU is going to be down, which means there'll be more room to add additional plugins for EQ, compression, reverb, delay. Also, as we continue to save versions, that process will be a lot faster. Tip number 3, the special technique. We're almost there. You want to start by selecting the part of your song or beat that's the thickest. In other words, that has the most number of sounds playing at once. In my track, I have multiple sequences, and it's part B that has the thickest part. So I'm starting there at the beginning of part B. And then the next thing you want to do is go into your track mix. And if you have multiple tracks with different programs across those tracks, then you want to primarily work from the track mix screen for setting your levels. If you're lucky enough to just be working out of one program, you can set that program to 0 dB unity gain and go right into that program and then do all of your leveling from here. So the next thing we want to do is bring all of our levels down to the bottom. That's actually going to be minus infinity. So for my banjo, for example, that I recorded, I'm going to bring that down. For the bass, I'll bring that down. The noise, that's a special thing we'll talk about shortly. My xylophone I'm bringing down. My guitar I bring down. And this is hand pan B. I'm bringing all the way down. So I left drums and one-shots. These are actually programs that have multiple samples within them. I'll leave those at 0 dB, and then I'll come inside, and this is where I'll bring things down inside of each of those. Next, I want to make sure that my sends and returns are all at 0. So I'm flipping through the various sends, and I've got those all set to 0. You'll note some things also are muted. See the little red M's in here? Those are parts that are not used in this sequence. Remember this noise track that I said was special? This is actually a recording of pink noise. The reason you want to use pink noise as opposed to white or some other color is because pink noise, when you look at the spectrum of it over the frequencies, most closely resembles what actually entails a good mix, as you can see by this graph here. The way I've set this up is that if you look at my different tracks, you can see that I've got one track that is the noise track. So if I go to that track, I simply created a track that says noise, created a drum program called noise, and then I've assigned my pink noise sample to it. And this is what it sounds like. Then the next thing I did is I went into my grid, Shift and Main on the MPC One, and I placed a sample on every single one of my 32 measures. I can show you how to do that. I'll erase all for noise, so that's gone. And then I take the pencil and I'll just put 4 of them on there. You can select 4 and then copy, 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 copy. Boom, you've got one on every single bar. You'll see why we're doing it this way very shortly. Now, we'll come back to our track mix. If you, again, are working just within a single program, then instead of doing it that way, what you could do is go into your particular program and assign that noise sample to whatever program you're working with. So say I had drums, you would just add a noise sample directly to that program. Because what we're going to do now is we're going to play the noise and we're going to raise the level one by one of each individual sound until we can just hear it over that noise. And the goal here by the end is that we'll have a good starting point of all of the sounds balanced together because they're all going to be set roughly at whatever level we make the noise at. Right now the noise is set to 12 dB. I went through this whole process setting everything to minus 12 dB, which is often what I've done in the DAW. But I found that on this machine in the MPC environment, that was actually more than enough headroom. So I would actually suggest that you take it to -9, and that's what I'll do today. For this and any mixing you do, you want to use the flattest reference system you have, whether that's a good pair of studio monitors or some good studio headphones will work as well. Here we go. I'm going to start with my kick. I'll go into the pad mix, and I'm going to raise up the kick until I can just hear it over the noise. Right about there. Now I'm going to proceed and do that with the remainder of the sounds. What I'll want to do is actually mute the previous sound and work on the next. And I'll continue along this path. Now for my open hi-hat, if you look at the grid, you'll see that it's only hitting every 4 bars. So what I want to do is set my cue link, which is the sequence loop start and loop end, that's at the end here, and put the start right on that measure. So I can loop that measure. And now I can do the same thing with hitting play and adjusting my level. I'm not going to put you through that noise sound again, but that's how you deal with sounds that don't hit as often. We will mute the open hi-hat. And now we can jump out back into the track mix and continue mixing there. I'm going through each of the remaining tracks, looking at it in the grid to see where it's happening, zooming in on that, and then hitting play with just that track soloed and adjusting the level till I can hear it over the noise. I've sped this up, but the real elapsed time on this took me about 7 minutes. You can see on here that the perk, handpan, banjo, piano, these 4 tracks that are still all the way down are not used in this sequence. They're used on another sequence. So we've now leveled everything against the noise for everything playing in this sequence. Okay, I've unmuted everything. Now we can hit play and see how it sounds. I'd say that's pretty balanced. By the way, if you're finding this information helpful, I really appreciate if you can click that like button to show your support. So I'm coming back to this mix the second day, listening with fresh ears. And there's one thing that stands out to me, which is that the low end is a bit hyped. That's bound to happen for any of you using headphones that can't accurately produce the lowest frequencies. And that means that when you play them on speakers that can, it ends up getting distorted and blown out. My next 2 tips are going to show you how to fix that. But before we get into that, I have one more important point to share. When we set the levels here, we focused on one section of the song, and we balanced the mix by setting levels for the programs. Consider this your anchored instrument levels for the rest of the song. You can move on to the next thickest section of the song and continue setting the program levels for those instruments and samples and sounds we haven't touched yet, but don't change the program levels for the ones we've already set. Otherwise, you'll disrupt the balance of the song. Instead, for other sequences, you can use the MIDI track levels to make relative adjustments. And if you want to adjust the levels for other sections in the same sequence, then use automation on these MIDI track levels. The nice thing about this approach is that if you want to bring any particular instrument up or down, like your lead, then you can adjust that for the whole song by changing your program levels. Just make sure that you listen to the entire song again to make sure that it sounds good. For this tip, and really the next thing I would tackle at this stage of mixing, would be your low end, namely your kick and your bass. You can put an EQ on the rest of your instruments and roll off anything below 100 to 150 hertz. Just use your ears to make sure that you're not losing any fundamentals for those instruments. And then I will also put an EQ on the kick. We know that our kick is hitting at 55 hertz, so we can roll off anything below that. To dial this in properly, I actually turned on my sub so that I could see what's happening. At around 47 with this roll off seems to be about the sweet spot. You can also use this EQ on your kick to scoop out a little bit of the frequencies where your bass resides so that it has room to come through. And then from here, I'd go over to your bass and also put an EQ on your bass, rolling off a little higher to make room for the kick. And then lastly, for the low end, and this is really the key tip here, is I would send both your kick and your bass to a separate bus. So in this case, we would take our kick, and instead of sending it to the program, sometimes if you click that, it doesn't work. So if you go to route, then you can do it this way. And I'm choosing sub 1 in this case. And then I'll go over to my bass and route and do the same thing there. Send it to sub 1. Now with sub 1, if we go to our submixes here, we can easily control the entire low end by just bringing up or down the levels for that submix. I'll also put a compressor on my submix to control the transients when the kick and the bass are hitting together right at the beginning. And then I'll put an EQ after that so I can dial in the sound a little more. After EQ and compression comes panning, reverbs, and delays to place the instruments and sounds around the sonic space to get depth in the mix. And then once we've done that, we get to tip number 5. I was able to get this particular song loud enough with just a few plugins on the master bus. No other external gear or DAW required. I've just loaded the final version of my master, and if I go to track mix, main outs, you can see I've got 3 different plugins here on the master, and I'm going to show you each of these, and I'll demo them for you too. Let me just show you the difference without the limiter in terms of levels. That's without, this is with it on. So that's what I was talking about before, where you don't need to go all the way down to -12 dB, because if you come into this limiter, you can see I'm using almost 29 decibels of gain. And if you go back to the step of leveling and use your noise set at 9 decibels, then I think you're not going to have to add as much gain when you get to this stage. So there's really not much to the limiter. You're just trying to get your mix to get up to as close to 0 as possible. And I'm using -2 dB there with a really quick release and turning everything below 100 Hertz to mono. So with the limiter on, I can now show you EQ. First, I'll show you the high-low cut. 20K, it's whatever. It's at the edge of human hearing. It's not going to be doing all that much. We are trimming below 41 with a harder dB roll-off. We know our lowest bass sound, which is the kick, is at 55 Hertz, so we're well below that. And then here on the EQ, I spent some time working down from the top, listening to the mix and trying bold changes at first and then dialing it back to see what sounded best. The boost to the highs really brightened up a lot of the reverb texture, and I liked what this setting did for the high mids as well. Brought down the low mid to reduce some muddiness, and then I brought down below 92.5 Hertz with a gentle roll off, and that's a shelf, not a bell curve, to fix some of the low end issues I was experiencing when I was referencing on different systems. So I'll demo what that sounds like. This is before, after. So it's subtle, but you could probably tell the difference if you listen for it. The final step then is to add the compression. I was just looking to tame any small transients. I didn't want to highly compress this mix because it's not a dance track that I'm trying to get as loud as possible for the dance floor. Rather, more than anything, want to just pull down in any of the transients that are sticking out so that I can get a more average loudness overall. So these are the settings I used for the compressor. I'll fast forward to the louder parts where it's going to make a difference. You can see it's just barely working there, which is all I'm looking for. And that's everything I did in terms of mastering. And I'm really happy with the results. I didn't have to use any external gear. Everything from the production to the mixing to the mastering was all done standalone on the MPC. My favorite part about this whole process was that I did 90% of it with the MPC in my lap sitting in my easy chair. If you have any questions, I invite you to leave a comment down below. If you're new here and haven't yet, I invite you to subscribe, and I'll see you around.